Hi, and welcome to our second set of notes on biochemistry. In this set of notes, we are going to talk about carbohydrates and lipids, or lipids are another word for fats. So we're going to start with talking about carbohydrates. Carbohydrates are commonly referred to as sugars and starches. So let's look at the word carbohydrate for a second. Okay. So when we look at carbo, we see the prefix carbo. Carbo refers to carbon. Okay. And we also see in the word carbohydrate, hydrate. Well, we've talked about hydrate a little bit in terms of hydrate refers to water. So when we're looking at the word carbohydrate, what we're looking at actually is the atoms that are essentially present in a carbohydrate, because you have carbon and then you have hydrogen and oxygen. And just like water, for carbohydrates, we have the same ratio of of hydrogen to oxygen, in that we have 2 hydrogens for every oxygen in a carbohydrate. So the word carbohydrate actually refers to the elements that are present in this molecule that we're dealing with. So carbohydrates have carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. The hydrogen and oxygen are in a 2-to-1 ratio, but the number of carbons can actually vary depending upon the document, or depending upon the molecule. We have 3 types of carbohydrates, so let's look at these words for a second. Saccharide, which you'll notice is in all 3 of them. Saccharide, the word saccharide means sweet, okay? Or you might sometimes, it's a very old school saying, but grandma might refer to somebody as being saccharine. That means that they are overly sweet, okay? So saccharide, saccharin, refers to sweetness. The prefix mono, we talked about in class. Mono means 1. So monosaccharide is 1 sugar. A disaccharide, di is a prefix that means 2. So di means 2. So a disaccharide is 2 sugars linked together, which means we're going to put together 2 monosaccharides. And then we talked about in class that poly means many. So poly is going to be multiple monosaccharides linked together. Okay. So we're going to start with talking about monosaccharides. So monosaccharides are the monomer, or remember, monomer means it's a building block. So the monosaccharides are your building blocks of your... So all sugars, all carbohydrates are made out of a monosaccharide. Monosaccharides are termed simple sugars, where we have a ratio of 1 carbon to 2 hydrogens to 1 oxygen for monosaccharides. We typically write this as CH2O to the N, where N is anywhere from 3 to 8. So I could say that my formula is CH2O to the 3. My 3 multiplies by the numbers that are, the subscripts that are on the inside. So CH2O to the 3 becomes C3H6O3. If I had the formula of CH2O to the 6, my formula would become C6H12O6, which is your formula for glucose. Glucose is your simple sugar that all cells rely upon for an energy source. The most common monosaccharides that we deal with are glucose, fructose, and galactose. They all have the same formula, which is C6H12O6. Glucose is used by your body for energy. Fructose is a very sweet sugar. It's typically found in fruits. And galactose is one of the monosaccharides that's found in milk. Most of you are probably thinking about lactose, but that's a little bit different. We'll talk about that in a minute. So the fact that glucose, fructose, and galactose all have the same formula, but when you look at the pictures here, you can see that glucose and fructose are shaped differently. The fact that they're shaped differently is important because the shaping makes them actually function differently. And so the fact that they have the same formula but different shapes makes them what's called an isomer. Isomers are chemicals that have the same formulas, but they're shaped differently. And so when they're shaped differently, they can't do the same things within a cell. Disaccharides, remember the prefix is di means 2. So disaccharides are your double sugars. It's two monosaccharides linked together. Okay, so this is two monosaccharides joined. Okay, the two most common examples of disaccharides that we deal with are sucrose and lactose. Sucrose is your table sugar. It's what you use to bake. It is a fructose molecule linked to a glucose molecule. The other disaccharide that we deal with or we care about a lot for humans is lactose. Lactose is the sugar that's in milk. It's actually galactose, the monosaccharide, linked to a glucose molecule. So typically most humans can actually break this bond that's holding these two together. We can break this apart. And so most of us can digest lactose and there's no problems. But people who are lactose intolerant, the reason they're lactose intolerant is they can't break the bond that's holding the glucose and galactose together. And so the lactose then makes them sick because of that. We'll talk about this a little bit more when we get into talking about enzymes in a little bit. Polysaccharides are our polymers, or our very complex and large molecules that we deal with. So polysaccharides are made up of 3 or more monosaccharides linked to each other. We have 3 main ones that we concern ourselves with. One is glycogen, which is what animals use to store their energy. So we use glycogen as our energy source, that when we take in lots of glucose, our body can store it in the form of glycogen. Our body makes it in either our liver or stores it up in our muscles for us. And what this is actually hundreds of glucose molecules that are linked together and attached to each other through a dehydration synthesis reaction. So glycogen is a highly branched chain. What this means is that we have our main chain of glucoses, but then we also have a whole bunch of glucoses attached off on the side as well to make this really large molecule. Starch is an equivalent to glycogen. So humans, we store our excess carbohydrates as glycogen. Plants store them as starch. Starch actually comes in 2 forms. One type is highly branched, like we make for glycogen, and the other is that it could just be a really long straight chain. But starch is what we consume when we eat complex carbohydrates. We eat those complex carbohydrates, and then our body will break down the starch molecules to release the individual glucose molecules so that we can then absorb them and either use them or store them. Plants also make cellulose. Cellulose provides strength and rigidity to plant cells. So cellulose is thousands of glucose chains that are linked together, and they make a long straight chain. And so we get these long chains. And then in between those long chains, we get hydrogen bonds that are going to hold these together, which makes it very, very difficult for humans specifically to break down cellulose. So cellulose actually serves a purpose in our body, and the purpose that we have is that cellulose is fiber. So we eat cellulose to help keep our body functioning correctly. Fiber takes up space in our stomach, so we don't eat as much food. And then it's also really good because it makes your intestines work better. And so it will make your intestines send the wasted food through the system faster. So in other words, what fiber is going to do is it's going to help you go poo. Okay, so we're going to move on and we're going to start talking about lipids. Lipids is the fancy scientific word for fats. So lipids are another word for fats. Lipids are very large molecules. They're nonpolar, and the fact that they're nonpolar is important. The nonpolar nature, meaning that the electrons are shared equally in a lipid, is the reason why they don't mix with water. So this is why when we did the water penny lab, the oil and the water wouldn't mix together. Nonpolar molecules will not dissolve in water, which is polar. Lipids have a very high ratio or high number of carbons and hydrogens in comparison to their oxygen. So lipids tend to have lots of carbons, lots of hydrogens, very little oxygen. These carbon hydrogens, the bonds that connect them together, store lots of energy. And so lipids are used as an energy storage molecule. Our lipids are made up of fatty acids and glycerol, and we'll talk about those more in a few minutes. And there's multiple types of lipids. We're going to spend a decent amount of time talking about triglycerides, which are your fats and oils. We'll also talk about phospholipids, but we're going to focus on phospholipids when we talk about the cell membrane and how stuff moves into and out of cells. Other 2 categories of lipids include steroids and waxes. So we'll talk about those briefly as well. So triglycerides are made up of molecules of fatty acids and glycerols. So when we look at this section of the molecule here, all the way down the end, each of these is a fatty acid, okay? This piece here is a glycerol molecule. Fatty acids are unbranched chains of carbon and hydrogen. So you can see all the carbons and hydrogens here. This is where we're going to actually store most of our energy that we have. So a fatty acid is a long, typically straight chain of carbons that have at one end a COOH. The COOH, that's that carboxyl group we mentioned in class. Okay. The COOH, the carboxyl, is a hydrophilic group. What that means is that it's going to love water and it's going to want to hang out with water. The COOH actually can make things acidic. So on one end of the molecule, we have a COOH. On the other side of it, so the rest of this is all a long hydrocarbon chain, which is entirely nonpolar. So the hydrocarbon chain, because it's nonpolar, it doesn't want to be anywhere near water. It's what we call hydrophobic. And we'll talk about these terms much more later on as well. The glycerol molecule, this molecule here, has 3 carbon atoms, 1, 2, 3, and the carbon atoms have hydrogens attached to them. So what we're going to talk about a little bit more is the individual fatty acids. So fatty acids can be either a straight chain, like you see in this image of saturated fatty acids. So saturated fatty acids, what this means is that each carbon is bonded to 4 different atoms. So you see here, this little carbon is bonded to a hydrogen, a carbon, a hydrogen, and a carbon. Each and every one of these carbon atoms in the center is bonded to 2 different hydrogens and 2 different carbons. So it makes a straight chain. Saturated fats are solids at room temperature, and they are very hard to break down. Conversely, we can have what are called unsaturated fats. Unsaturated fats, unlike saturated fats, have double bonds in them, like you see right here and right here. What the double bonds do is they actually put angles into your chain. So you notice on this fat picture that there's kinks and angles in here, whereas on this one they're nice and tight and next to each other. So these kinks and angles that are in here make it harder for the fatty acids to pack together tightly. And so unsaturated fats typically end up being oils at room temperature. With an unsaturated fat, the carbons are no longer bonded to 4 different molecules. So if you look at this carbon right here, we've got a carbon on one side, we've got a hydrogen, and then we've got a carbon on the other side. So I've got 3 different atoms that we're bonded to instead of the 4 like we see with the saturated. Typically what I refer to unsaturated fats as is fats with attitude. And so if somebody reminds me in class, we'll talk about saturated versus unsaturated fats and fats with attitude. So the triglyceride is 3 fatty acids and the glycerols linked together. Your saturated fats, they are animal fats. So these are things like butter, lard, the piece of fat that's on a side of steak. They are solid at room temperature. So we said that already. And they tend to have very high melting temperatures. They don't melt easily. Unsaturated triglycerides, on the other hand, are liquid at room temperature. And they come from seeds and fruits. These are always oils. Both saturated and unsaturated fats, triglycerides in general, are used for 2 purposes within their organisms. They're used as either a long-term energy storage or they're used for insulation, keeping things warm. Our next type of lipid is what's called a phospholipid. So with the phospholipid, we still have our glycerol molecule that we had before, which in this case we've drawn it as the circle. And we got 2 fatty acids instead of 3 now. The 3rd spot on the glycerol actually has a phosphate group on it instead. So this is a little bit different. Our triglyceride, we had 3 fatty acids. But with the phospholipid, we have 2 fatty acids, a glycerol, and a phosphate group. These phospholipids are going to be important because they're going to make up the cell membrane, which is also referred to as a lipid bilayer. And the purpose of your cell membrane is to control what goes into a cell and out of a cell. We're going to spend a lot of time when we go over cell membranes and how they work, explaining and talking about these phospholipids in more detail. So waxes are long chains of fatty acids that are joined to a long alcohol chain. So these molecules, like a glycerol, we get long fatty acids linked to something else. They are going to be highly waterproof, and they're going to provide protective layers. We find waxes, not just the waxes that like bees make, but we also find waxes on the surface of a leaf, and the purpose of that is to keep the water from evaporating off of the leaf. Different animals, especially your aquatic animals, will have waxes on them, and like penguins, their feathers will have a layer of wax on them, and that is to prevent the bird from becoming soaked, and the feathers from becoming soaked and waterlogged, so that they can actually fly. Our final type of lipid that we're going to talk about briefly is what's called a steroid. Steroids have 4 rings of carbon, so we got 4 little rings right here. Okay, so right here, this is a ring, a ring, a ring, and a ring. So I've got 4 rings. This is 1 ring, a 2nd ring, my 3rd ring, and my 4th ring. Okay, 4 rings of carbons that are fused together or joined together, and they have different groups attached to them that are going to give them very specific functions. Some of our steroids are hormones, like estrogen and testosterone, and their purpose in your body is to control chemical reactions and make things happen. Another steroid that will come up later when we talk about cell membranes is cholesterol, which is used to provide structure for things. Now, term steroids in general gets a bad rap because people, when they think of steroids, think of bodybuilders and athletes that are using steroids inappropriately. However, the term steroid is just a way to describe a molecule. It's a classification or a description. Some of you take steroid medications frequently. Anybody that's on an inhaler is likely on a steroid inhaler, like albuterol. And the purpose of that inhaler is to prevent swelling in your lungs so that you can actually breathe. If you've ever taken prednisone because of infections for something, you've taken a steroid. So steroids in and of themselves are not bad. It's just a classification of molecule. Where they get a bad rap is when people use them inappropriately for negative reasons. Okay, as always, write down what questions you have. Be prepared to ask them in class.